The live button has been pressed. You can go ahead, Nathalie.
Tensei, bonjour. Good morning, bonjour. My name is Nathalie Kermoal. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies, as well as the director of the Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research. Welcome to this special live stream presentation on self-government with the Métis Nation of Alberta. So we will be starting in a good way, and we'll be doing the land acknowledgements. The University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. So for those of you who don't know what the Rupert's Land for Métis Research is, the Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research, or RCMR as it's often known, is a joint venture between the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Rupert's Land Institute for Métis Excellence, the Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta. It's housed in the Faculty of Native Studies at the university, and RCMR is an academic research program specifically geared towards Métis issues. And last year we celebrated our 10-year anniversary. So the goals and objectives of the research center include building provincial and national connections with the Métis community, increasing research capacity to advance Métis-specific research, and training and employing student researchers. So during this session, questions can be asked at any time in the live chat, and they will be relayed to presenters after each presentation. So now I'm going to turn towards my colleague, Dr. Shalene Jobin, who is a professor as well as a Canada Research Chair in the Faculty of Native Studies. Shalene.
Hello, everyone. It's a real honor for me to be here today and to introduce two people that I really look up to. Our presenter number one is Métis Nation of Alberta President Audrey Poitras, and she is one of the highest profile Métis women in Canada. Audrey was elected as the first female president in 1996, becoming the longest serving president of the MNA. This is a strong statement that displays the trust and leadership she has gained. Audrey has been a strong advocate for Métis rights and will continue to move the Métis rights agenda forward with the help of the Daniels Supreme Court decision in 2016. Audrey is recognized within Alberta as a leader who is committed to helping build a better economic future for the Métis Nation. Under her leadership, the MNA continues to be a model of success in representing and pursuing the social, political, and economic interests of the Métis people in Alberta. Following the signing of the MOU with Canada in January 2017, the MNA signed a historic framework agreement with the Government of Canada on November 16, 2017, that will provide a strong focus on Métis rights, accommodation, and self-governance. Her presentation title is No Other Weapon Except Organization: The History and Evolution of the Métis Nation of Alberta. Please warmly welcome President Poitras.
Thank you very much, Shalene, and good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the University of Alberta and the Rupert's Land Center for Métis Research for supporting and organizing today's event. I also want to extend my warmest greetings to all the virtual viewers watching online today. The Métis Nation and the Métis Nation within Alberta in particular is beginning a new chapter. For generations, we have fought for our right to self-determination, for our right to self-government. Now, finally, full recognition of Métis Nation self-government in Alberta is within our grasp. We have an opportunity to truly move our nation forward. To begin with, let me be clear. We are not fighting for the right to self-government. We already have the right. We, the Métis Nation, are an Indigenous people, and the right to self-government is inherent in us as an Indigenous people. Quite frankly, Métis Nation self-government is a fact and a force that cannot be ignored. Our tradition of self-government is as old as our nation, beginning with the birth of the Métis Nation in the early 1800s in what would eventually become Canada. Métis people have always fought to organize ourselves and to govern ourselves. When hunting the vast herds of bison that roamed the prairies was the most important economic activity in our homeland, we made our own laws to govern these hunts. Others tried to displace us, but we constantly prevailed. In 1816, colonial authorities in the Red River tried to restrict the trade in pemmican. In response, the Métis, led by Cuthbert Grant, captured Fort Brandon, a Hudson Bay Company post. The victory, which we remember as the Battle of Frog Plain, cemented our status as an independent nation. In 1849, the Hudson Bay Company challenged our independence again and charged a Métis man, William Sayer, with illegally trading bison hides in violation of the company's so-called monopoly. We resisted, the company failed, Mr. Sayer went unpunished, and the Métis Nation's independence was affirmed. Later in the years, following Confederation, Canada pushed its way into our homeland. The Métis Nation, this time led by Louis Riel, resisted again. The means of resistance chosen by Riel was not just protest, not just arms. It was a radical act of self-determination. After intense consultation and deliberation, the Métis Nation declared a provisional government, our own government, by us and for us. The powers of the provisional government were inherent because we, the Métis Nation, are Indigenous. This was the unequivocal statement that Riel made in the Red River, and he forced the Crown to listen. As a result, the Métis and Canada negotiated the Manitoba Act, bringing the Red River into the newly formed Dominion. When our future as a nation has depended on it, we as a nation have not hesitated to rise to the challenge and assume control of ourselves. That is what makes us who we are. We, the Métis Nation, are Otipimsuak, the people who own themselves. But our fight has not always been easy. Following our stand at Batoche, Canada defrauded our ancestors of their land and birthright by giving them scrip and empty promises. Then for nearly 100 years, Canada denied the Métis Nation's rights, denied the Métis Nation's claims against the Crown, and denied any responsibility to seek reconciliation with the Métis Nation. During this time, however, we organized. 90 years ago, in 1928, Métis people in Alberta came together and founded what is now the Métis Nation of Alberta. Together, we fought for our rights and we fought for our lands. It was the Métis Nation of Alberta's efforts, Métis people living on and off those lands, that led to the establishment of the Métis settlements. And we continued to build. 35 years ago, Métis Urban Housing Corporation, Métis Child and Family Services, and Apitagosan Métis Development Inc. were started. 25 years ago, delivery of education, training, and research programs for Métis began with the Rupert's Land Institute. And 20 years ago, Métis Crossing was beginning the planning for what we have today. The Métis Nation of Alberta has the only objectively verifiable registry of citizens of the Métis Nation in the province. The Métis Nation of Alberta, which includes our provincial, regional, and local councils, is the only authorized representative of rights-bearing Métis Nation citizens in this province. Self-government for the Métis Nation within Alberta has always been our goal, and we have always seen a constitution written by us and for us as the way to achieve that goal. In 1982, Canada amended its own constitution to include Section 35, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal rights of Canada's Aboriginal people, including the Métis. Following this, a series of constitutional conferences were held between the Prime Minister, the province's First Ministers, and representatives of Canada's Aboriginal people. The goal was to give greater definition to Section 35, including by making the right to Aboriginal self-government explicit. At the time, the Métis Association of Alberta, as we were then known, produced a report on Métis self-government in Alberta to inform the constitutional conferences. In the report, one principle comes through loud and clear. Métis governments must have the power to establish and amend our own internal constitutions. This power, the power to define ourselves politically and legally, lies at the heart of the right to self-government and self-determination. In the mid-1990s, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People undertook engagements and research across the country regarding the state of Canada's Aboriginal people. To support this work, we, the Métis Nation within Alberta, struck our own commission, the Alberta Métis Otipemisiwak Commission. What did our commission recommend? Among other things, that we adopt our own constitution, a constitution for the Métis Nation within Alberta. Following this, the 1996 resolutions from our annual assembly continued, providing clear direction to the M&A leadership to move the M&A out of the Societies Act and to establish the M&A as an independent Métis government. In 2008, a report was produced called A New Direction, a Métis governance plan for Alberta. The first recommendation of this report was that an Alberta Métis constitution be adopted to affirm our nationhood and safeguard our rights, governance structures, and self-government aspirations. Once again, resolutions from 2009 until 2016 continued on the need to develop a new governance framework model. In 2017, another report was presented, the Métis Nation of Alberta Governance Framework Review Report. It was produced in conjunction with the University of Alberta's Faculty of Native Studies. Again, it was recommended that the M&A adopt a constitution to define our governance framework and declare our rights as citizens of the Métis Nation within Alberta. Calls to adopt our own constitution have been consistent at our annual assemblies for as long as I have attended them, and for good reason. We as a nation know what we need to fully express our right to self-government. Through the decades, however, our efforts to develop and adopt our own constitution faced a persistent barrier, the Crown. Our right to self-government does not depend on recognition by the Crown. It comes from our existence as a distinct Indigenous people. But if the federal and provincial governments will not recognize our institutions of self-government, then legal conflict and underfunding are inevitable. For decades, this was the situation we found ourselves in. We knew what we needed, but Canada and Alberta refused to accept this. At this point in time, we have two governments that we have two very different relationships with. Not because of the color of the political party or their left or their right political leanings from the Métis Nation's point of view. I will begin with the not so good relationship. One of the avenues available to any nation, like the Métis Nation of Alberta, is the Canadian judicial system. And in the past week, there has been an important legal development I must address today. Our recent legal battle involves the Kenney government in Alberta and a Métis consultation policy. You know right off the bat that things are not going well when the leader of Alberta's government refers to Indigenous people of Canada, the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis, in many of his speeches and press conferences as First Nation only. The Métis Nation of Alberta has a proud and strong membership of over 52,000. And to be not recognized by the democratic government in this province is truly insulting. The first outstanding and contentious issue of Crown consultation with Alberta Métis continues to undermine both Métis rights and resource development in this province. While Alberta has consultation policies in place for Métis Nation, for First Nations, and the 8 Alberta Métis settlements, the vast majority of Métis citizens and communities are never consulted by Alberta when Métis lands, rights, and interests are impacted by resource development. Alberta's approach stands in stark contrast to the federal government, who regularly consults with the MNA, which includes its regions and locals located throughout Alberta. In October of 2014, the Progressive Conservative government, led by Jim Prentice, and subsequently the new Democratic Party government, led by Rachel Notley, engaged in formal negotiations with the MNA to develop a Métis consultation policy. In December of 2018, a draft policy was presented to Cabinet with direction that further consultations be undertaken. In April of 2019, the UCP government, led by Jason Kenney, was elected. Shockingly, in September of 2019, Alberta's Indigenous Affairs Minister, Rick Wilson, wrote to the MNA stating that it, and I'll quote, will not be moving forward with the draft consultation policy, unquote. Ending 5 years of negotiations without explanation for the decision. Indigenous people who are negotiating in good faith with other governments should never have to sue those governments to understand why they unilaterally cut off negotiations. The whole point of negotiations is to talk to each other before either side takes unilateral action. The MNA filed for a judicial review of Minister Wilson's decision. In the litigation, Alberta denied it was even negotiating with the MNA or that the Honour of the Crown was engaged by its decision to terminate negotiations. Alberta also claimed it owed no duty or obligations to the MNA whatsoever. In her 75-page decision that was released in January of 2022, the Honourable Justice Burnett Ho of the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench rejected Alberta's position that it was not negotiating with the MNA or that the Honour of the Crown was not engaged. However, Justice Ho went on to conclude that Alberta met the duties and obligations it owed the MNA by simply advising that it would not be proceeding with a Métis consultation policy. In justifying Alberta's decision, Justice Ho relied extensively on rationales set out in internal and secret government documents that were never disclosed to the MNA at the time negotiations were terminated. Based on a unanimous resolution of the MNA Provincial Council last week, we filed an appeal of Justice Ho's decision to the Alberta Court of Appeal. In the appeal, the MNA claims that Justice Ho erred in considering and applying the application of the honor of the Crown, including the Crown's duty to negotiate with the MNA. This is the first Alberta case to deal with the Crown's duty to negotiate with Indigenous people, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in decisions, including the monumental Daniels case in 2016. If the honor of the Crown in 2022 means that governments don't even have to explain the rationale for their decisions to the Indigenous partners they are negotiating with, how is this attitude any different than what we've seen in the last 150 years? An attitude that has led to national protests, shocking historical findings, and the urgent need for reconciliation. We'll let all citizens know when the appeal happens. Our second relationship is with the Government of Canada, and it's stronger than it's ever been because of its acceptance and adoption by the Trudeau government of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 94 calls to action. In January of 2017, the Métis Nation of Alberta signed a memorandum of understanding with the Government of Canada. It recognized that reconciliation with the Métis Nation after over a century of colonial policies and approaches is hard work, but we are finally on the right track. It had been the lack of recognition and respect for our Métis self-government structures, our Métis lands, and our Métis rights that has been so destructive to our people, our communities, and our nationhood. The goal of the MOU was to finally get the relationship right, based on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government approach between the Crown and the MNA, whether it be in closing the gaps in areas of housing, education, economic development, employment, or child and family services. It will be made easier because we will be able to work on these things together. The MOU established a bilateral table between Canada and the MNA to begin to deal with issues such as rights, lands, and our outstanding claims against the Crown in Alberta. The MOU had also enabled us to work together to engage the province of Alberta and the Alberta Métis settlements in reconciliation, because the unique history and realities of the Métis in Alberta must be acknowledged and respected in any process in order to advance reconciliation. In June of 2019, in a truly historic day, the Métis Nation of Alberta signed Métis Self-Government Recognition Agreement with the Government of Canada. It is not an exaggeration to say that the agreement signed was something for which Métis in Alberta had been fighting for close to a century, as Canada finally recognized our right to self-government. I have always believed that once we get recognition right, everything else will fall into place for the Métis Nation within Alberta, and we are well on our way. When Métis in Alberta founded the MNA in 1928, they did it because no existing government, provincial or federal, cared to address the needs of the Métis in the province. We Métis needed to look out for ourselves, and we had a right to do so. After settlers from Eastern Canada pushed into our homeland following Confederation, the Métis were left largely landless. We were literally left by the wayside, forced to squat on narrow strips of crown land set aside by Dominion surveyors on the edges of new towns and roads. This is how we became known as the Road Allowance people. The Métis Nation, the proud new people of the Northwest, were now refugees in our own homeland. Colonization pushed the Métis Nation to the geographic margins of Canadian society, but legally, we were forced to the margins as well. No government, neither provincial nor federal, wanted anything to do with the Métis. The province said we were Indians and a federal problem. Canada said that our rights, if we ever had any, were extinguished and that we were not their responsibility. This went on for decades. Courts have called it political football, buck passing, a jurisdictional wasteland, a legal laguna. However, it is described, one thing is certain. It was a shameful chapter in Canadian history. The Crown turned its back on one of the country's founding people, the Métis. Self-government is a fundamental pillar of the Métis Nation. Self-government is now and has always been a part of what makes us who we are. Generations of MNA leaders and citizens have dreamt of the day Canada would recognize us as the legitimate Indigenous government for our people. Many in the Métis Nation thought that day would never come. Canada formally acknowledged what we in the Métis Nation have always known to be true. The Métis Nation within Alberta deserves self-government. The Métis Nation within Alberta has a right to self-government. Reconciliation requires us to work together, to challenge long-held assumptions, to rebuild the status quo. Reconciliation requires transformative change. Now it's up to us. The citizens of the Métis Nation within Alberta to take the reins and drive our own future. We need to write our own constitution and build our own government. These are enormous tasks, but I know that we are up to the challenge. The basis of the newly recognized Métis Nation government in Alberta will be our constitution. Recognition of the Métis Nation's right to self-government will mean recognition that the MNA as a modern Métis government has the power to make laws about those matters most important to us as a nation. Who our citizens are, how our leaders are chosen, and what powers they have. How Métis rights can be exercised, how we protect the welfare of our citizens. These laws will allow us to develop and deliver culturally appropriate programs and services to meet our unique needs as Métis people. This is something that the federal and provincial governments will not and cannot do for us, as these will be the tangible benefits of Métis Nation self-government in Alberta. I know I always like to say, governments come and governments go, but the Métis Nation is and will always be here. I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, President Poitras, for that amazing speech. We are so grateful to have you here today with us. We're just waiting for questions to come in. I invite everyone who is engaged with us on the YouTube live stream to enter your questions into the live chat, and I will ask them to President Poitras. So one question comes from Shalene Jobin, who asks, what are the next steps on the Constitution process? Is there a hopeful timeline?
Thank you, Shalene. So the next steps are, right now we have gone through two sessions on the Constitution. First, we had a session of roundtables with all of the structures of our current existing Métis Nation of Alberta under the Societies Act. We've met with we've had 14 roundtables. After that was done, we did a what we heard report, what people advised us on to include in the next draft. We had a next draft, we went out and we did 20 community gatherings around the province. Small because of COVID, but we did 20 gatherings all across our province to hear feedback on the second draft. We have now finished that. The only part we have left on that, we are in the midst of meeting with the different settlements to talk about the settlement portion within our Constitution. And then we will be producing another what we heard report that will work towards the third draft. From there, we will determine if there's substantial changes that we need to go out for another round of consultations, or if we have clearly had most people speak in favor of it with minor changes, then we will be calling a special assembly or going to our annual assembly in August for a vote on that Constitution. Following that, we have made the decision to also have a ratification process where we have people right now working on different ways that we can make sure that every citizen of the Métis Nation that wants to vote on our Constitution can. So we're looking at ways through social media, through ballot boxes, through meetings, through all of those different kinds of ways that people would be able to have an opportunity to vote for ratification. We're not sure what that timeline will be. It will depend what our next draft looks like.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Angie Saltman, who asks, is there anything that us general citizens can do to help?
Thank you, Angie. Yes, I believe we want all citizens to be involved in this. We have a website, a specific part of it for the Constitution. You're open to do online questions, answers, bringing it out there as much as you can. We do advertise when we're going out to the regions. We want you to all be involved. Pass on the word to your neighbors. If they don't have a copy of the draft, make sure that help us get the word out there so people can really have input into what their Constitution will look like.
Wonderful. I have a thank you from Keith King, who also asks, what is the MNA doing to ensure that we don't repeat the colonial harms of Canada, to ensure our often overlooked Métis kin are heard in government, specifically 2S LGBTQIA+ kin?
We are having, as an example, when we did our roundtables, we don't have an established LGBTQ2 a society within Alberta for Métis, but we've certainly had participants. We had an open forum where we had the women's group had invited the LGBTQ participants to be part of their roundtable. We've had a youth table, we've had a women's table, we've had each of our structures, and we've had many people participate from all of those areas when we've gone out to our community gatherings. So we're trying to, if there's any other way that you think we could get more people involved from all areas, please let us know. We have an email, constitution@métis.org, that you can ask us any questions, send us any information, provide us some advice on how you think we can better get the word out there. Thank you.
Next, we have a thank you coming from Walter and Drenef on behalf of the leadership and people of Region 5 and the Rupert's Land Center for Teaching and Learning. Thank you very much, Audrey, for your presentation.
Thank you, Walter. And Region 5.
All right, I think that we are just about out of questions. We're doing a last call. If anyone has anything burning for President Poitras. All right, Nathalie.
Yeah, I do have a quick question for President Poitras. I was just wondering, so you said that you were doing meeting in different regions and talking to community members. I was just curious if it's possible, just to get a sense of the responses and the type of responses that you're getting from the Métis citizens out there.
Sure. Nathalie, in our first go around, when we had the round tables, we clearly had, we did it purposely just for our internal structures, so that we would be going out saying, this is where we are today, and this is what our leaders of the day, whether it was our locals, our women's group, our youth group, are saying that they would like to see the Constitution look like. So we had a lot of input there. When we went to the second round, we went out to communities. We decided we would do 3 per region. As you know, we have 6 regions within the province of Alberta. Then we determined that because of the population of Edmonton and Calgary, we would do an extra one in each Edmonton and Calgary, which we did. And what we got was, on the second go round, what we got was, yes, a lot of good comments that people said, you're on the right track. This is going forward. We're seeing where we want to go. And we had some areas where people said, I think you could change this to look differently. You could add more districts, or you could take away more districts. So different, we haven't seen the second compiled what we heard report that our technicians are doing for us. We will be doing that within the next week or 2. And that will really give us an idea of, that's what we're looking for, to be able to determine, do we need to do more consultations, or how are people, you're never going to get it perfect, but are people pretty comfortable with what it is if we made some of the changes that were already suggested and go to that vote? I've of course been at every single one of them. I do chair the Constitution Commission meetings, and we've had a lot of really good feedback. We have had some people who say, no, I don't like it. I want to stay where we are. Then we've had some people who have clearly said, instead of having delegates elected to an assembly, you should only have elected people to what we call the provincial council today, but what would be the representative council of the new body. They should be appointed, not elected. So there's some ideas like that we don't know exactly how many for or against. So that's what we'll see when we get the report. But overall, I would say we've had a lot of input, even though we've only been able to have small crowds. Lots of really good input, where generally our sessions went over the time limit because people had lots to offer. So it's been a good definitely a lot of people have participated.
Thank you.
We have a question from Michaela, who asks, has there been any scholarly research used to inform the consultation? process? And if so, is there a reference list that's available?
Scholarly references, did you say?
Scholarly research. So
Research? Okay. Yes, we do have, what we do have on the commission is we do have a researcher on staff who, when we got asked certain questions about why you haven't done this, or could this be something that would be included, we have Dr. Timothy Clark, who is on our commission, who is doing research for us. And every time we hear something else, we say, what is there out there that's on this that we could use instead of starting from scratch? So he's been doing a lot of research for us as we go along, which I'm presuming once we hear this next what we heard, there will be more that will be needed. At this point in time, we haven't put up any of that research on our website at this point in time, but that will become part of the historical evidence of how we went forward for sure.
Okay, wonderful. Wonderful. Krista Letty asks, how can we as Albertans talk to elected officials about the Alberta government's decision around nation-to-nation relationship building?
Thanks, Krista, for that. I think there's always ways we can talk to elected officials. Sometimes they hear and sometimes they don't. But I do believe that at different times over the years that I know, we've had letter writing campaigns to make sure that elected leaders, whether it's in the province or whether it's in the country, know that our citizens are 100% behind us in what we're doing. We certainly have had those opportunities to do. We'd certainly like to also hear from you, like Krista, and anyone else that's listening that has any other ideas of how we should try to communicate more with elected officials, both provincially and federally.
Okay, wonderful. I don't see any other questions, but lots of thank yous and lots of gratitude coming across the chat. And I think that we will move over to Shalene, who will introduce our next presenter. Thank you again, Audrey.
Thank you all very much.
Okay. I have the honor to present our next presenter, Jason Madden. Jason Madden is co-managing partner in the law firm Pape Salter Taillé LLP. The firm has offices in Toronto and Vancouver and represents First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, governments, and nations across Canada. Jason is a graduate of Osgoode Hall Law School and is called to the bar in Ontario, Manitoba, Alberta, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. His practice exclusively focuses litigation and negotiations related to Indigenous lands, rights, and self-governments, including the negotiation and implementation of modern-day treaties. He's appeared before every level of court from Ontario westward and the Supreme Court of Canada 12 times. Jason is a citizen of the Métis Nation and a descendant of the half-breeds of Rainy River and Rainy Lake in northwestern Ontario, who collectively adhered to Treaty Number 3 in 1875. His talk today is titled Leaving the Legal Lacuna, Recent Developments in Métis Self-Government. Please warmly welcome Jason Madden.
Thank you, Shalene. It's great to be here today and to present on this. President Poitras has done an excellent job on talking about the Métis Nation's political history, and I'm going to attempt to complement that with understanding the law related to Métis self-government. And I just want to start off my presentation by saying I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation, come from one of those historic communities that are a part of the historic Métis Nation homeland. And while my family is absolutely connected to the Red River, I'm one of those people from Lac Saint Anne, Parklands area Northwest Saskatchewan who identifies ourselves as being a part of one of the regional communities that make up the larger Métis Nation collective. So I speak today from that perspective and that and that understanding about where I come from in relation to the larger Métis Nation. I also want to just highlight that I practice in the area of Aboriginal law, which is Canadian Aboriginal law, which is largely made up of laws passed by Parliament or legislatures about Indigenous people, or pronounced by courts with often no Indigenous people on them about Indigenous people within Canada. And I think it's really important to start any discussion, in particular when you're talking about Métis rights and quote unquote modern Métis law that's been developed by the courts, that it isn't Métis law from an inherent right Métis perspective, and that those practicing in this area is always a bit of that trying to figure out the interaction between what Canadian courts have said and also how we ensure that that inherent right to self-determination and self-government that President Poitras referred to, that the Métis have always had and that other Indigenous peoples have as well, is reconciled within the narrative or within the country that is Canada. That's often a harder task and to figure out of how Indigenous law that comes from Indigenous peoples themselves interacts with Canadian Aboriginal law. But I think it's important to just start with recognizing that those two things are very, very different. And my presentation today is going to focus on a lot about what the Supreme Court of Canada has said in relation to Métis rights over the last 20 years. But I also want to highlight that the courts over the last 20 to 30 years that the Métis have been really turning to them increasingly has always been a means to an end. Canadian courts can never provide the answers about who are the Métis people, the full extent of our rights, how we choose the governments who represent us. That can only lie within the Métis themselves. We use the courts as leverage as well as tools in order to get to the places that we want to get, which is that recognition of our inherent rights, self-government, self-determination, as a distinct order of law and our own constitutions, not just subordinate to Canadian law, provincial laws, etc. That's a very ongoing challenge and process that all Indigenous peoples face within this country, in particular, those of us who practice in this area. I just always like starting with this increasingly to explain that, because people sometimes, there is nothing magical that courts have in relation to the answers to these questions. Métis people have the answers to these questions. We use the court to create the space that allows us to finally negotiate and engage in nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationships. The next point I also want to make is I give my presentation from a perspective of I'm one of the lawyers that have been in the courts, spent almost years of my life listening to elders, experts, historians, political leaders, community witnesses from the Métis Nation itself talk about these unique histories that of course lie in the Red River, but also lie along the watersheds from Ontario westward, along the North Saskatchewan River system, up along the Athabasca, in areas like Cadott Lake and others. And you really get a sense of, and I hope my presentation today can explain that regional diversity that exists within the broader Métis Nation is fundamental to understanding who we are as a people and where we come from, and also how the governments that have historically represented the Métis Nation, where they come from, and also where they're going in the future. So I'm going to put up a PowerPoint presentation because I often do provide this because I like visuals. And I'm going to try to give you a walkthrough of leaving the legal lacuna. I in one of the Supreme Court of Canada cases about the Métis, which was actually about the Alberta Métis settlements, the Chief Justice, Beverly McLaughlin, uses this alliteration, the legal lacuna, that I continue to repeat. It's because I didn't, at the time when I read it, I didn't know what lacuna meant. And lacuna just means gap. And it's a nice turn of phrase that she uses, that in relation to the Métis, as opposed to how colonization largely played out for First Nations, where Canada applied assimilationistic approaches, essentially through the Indian Act and other means. For the Métis, a large part of that was absolutely denial, disrespect, dispossession, and hoping that as a people, we would just dissolve into the body politic and be gone in a few generations. And that disrespect and denial created this legal gap within Canadian law that the court has said exists increasingly. The Supreme Court of Canada has said exists increasingly, but also that that's the place that we have been trying to say, well, there isn't really a gap. Métis law and our self-government and institutions already exist. It's just about weaving that recognition together with Canadian law, as well as our own law, to ensure that that space is there. And so this presentation is really going to talk about that history of denial, but also the evolution that we've used the courts to change, to essentially begin to fill that lacuna, but also more importantly, about where we're going today and how this constitution building, as well as the self-government negotiations, are really something that the Métis Nation has always pushed for. So I'm going to start with setting the stage for Canada, and I put this in quotation marks. And you'll notice I use the Supreme Court of Canada decisions in various cases over the last 20 years to kind of weave the story together, because one of the things that Métis have historically faced, as President Poitras spoke about, is governments have just outright ignored or treated us as, well, you're nothing but a society or an association, or dismissed that we held collectively held rights as opposed to just being seen as mixed ancestry individuals. And so I think that that fiction of those falsehoods, or that legal lacuna, lies deeply in the underlying narratives that Canada is based upon. So here's a quote from the Manitoba Métis Federation case in 2013, where the court says, Canada is a young nation with ancient roots. The country was formed in 1867 by consensual union. United Canada, Quebec, and Ontario, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Left unsettled was whether the new nation would be expanded to include the vast territories to the west, stretching from modern Manitoba to British Columbia. The Canadian government, led by Sir John A. Macdonald, embarked on a policy aimed at bringing the Western territories within the boundaries of Canada and opening them up to settlement. And then the court goes on to say, this meant dealing with the Indigenous peoples who were living in the Western territories. On the prairies, these consisted mainly of two groups, First Nations and the descendants of the unions of white traders and explorers and Aboriginal women, known as the Métis. The government policy regarding the First Nations was to enter into treaties with various bands whereby they agreed to settlement in their lands in exchange for reservations of land and other promises. The government policy with respect to the Métis population, which in 1870 comprised 85% of the population in what is now Manitoba, was less clear. Well, I would highlight that the less clear policy is a wonderful understatement. Canada's policy with respect to the Métis was largely whatever got us through the day when these people pushed back and asserted their rights and their basics for existence. I also just want to highlight that within this paragraph, you can see the problems that I start with in my presentation about how Canadian law approaches some of these issues. So the description of Métis simply being, the descendants of unions between white traders and explorers and Aboriginal women. We know that that's an overly simplistic concept of the ethnogenesis that occurs as our communities and we emerge as a people. that it's not just a mixing concept, but that it's a distinct peoplehood and nationhood that emerges. And also just in the language about how they describe the government policy with respect to First Nations, that they were simply about settlement of lands in exchange of reservations for land and other promises. Of course, First Nations see those as fundamental compacts and relationship agreements that are about sharing and reciprocity. And the Canadian courts often have a hard time reconciling that, the truth in relation to how these fundamental compacts and about Canada's Indigenous peoples with how they describe it within a general narrative. I also just want to highlight that, well, it talks about, that the MMF case was about the Métis and the Red River. Other Supreme Court of Canada cases have been about Métis and other parts of the Métis Nation homeland. Here's a quote from a case about that included the Alberta Métis, of recognizing that around the time of the negotiations of the Manitoba Act 1870, the Métis population of the Red River colony numbered roughly 9,000. The Métis population in the territories outside the Red River, though smaller, was still significant. It numbered more than 2,000. The Métis communities outside the colony included La Biche, Peace River, St. Albert, and Slave Lake, which were well established and dynamic. And these from the court cases that we've taken over the years, what we see is this network that interconnects these regional communities or regional populations, whether they be along the North Saskatchewan River or the Athabasca or on the Southern Plains, throughout the Métis Nation homeland. And those stories and those populations are just as important to that broader history as the well-known events within the Red River. But what we begin to see is this Canada's creation, and myth-making begins through maps and other legal fictions. This idea of just when you look at this map of the grayed out areas are like there's nothing happening there, as opposed to there's already peoples. There's peoples that are have been on those lands since time immemorial, and that have their own laws and governments and relationships to those lands long before Canada ever arrived. And I think that that's important when we are in this process of reconciliation and truth, of recognizing some of the intrinsic biases that lie within these maps that are still used within classrooms today. And of course, the well-known events in the Red River at 1869-70, which led to the Manitoba Act, which is recognized by the Métis as a treaty with Canada that set aside 23% of the land base within the old postage stamp province of Manitoba, and began the relationship that has been many times interrupted with Canada, and we still struggle with today of finding that rightful place within the Canadian Federation. That, of course, is the river lot lands, as well as where the 1.4 million 400,000 acres were to have been provided as a head start for the Métis and the Red River. And I think it's important to tell truths about our history. This is from Riel's journal when he's writing in 1885 about that deal in 1870, and he writes, when the Canadian government presented itself at our doors, it found us at peace. It found that the Métis people of the Northwest could not only live well without it, but it had a government of its own, free, peaceful, well-functioning, contributing to the land, contributing to the work of the civilization in a way that the company from England could never have done without 1,000 soldiers. It was a government with an organized constitution whose junction was more legitimate and worthy of respect because it was exercised over a country that belonged to it. And this is the fundamental tension that we still see within Canadian law, as well as Indigenous studies within Canada, that this idea that Canada was not was not just a bulldozer that drove westward and created a new narrative, that those laws, lands, and legal orders and traditions that come from the very lands themselves have to be reconciled with with the history of Canada, but also with Canadian law as it currently stands. Canada is a multi-juridical country. It is not just a law of, it is not just a state with just Canadian law or French laws. It also has Indigenous laws that need to be respected and woven into the fabric of Canada in order for Canada to maintain its constitutional legitimacy. And while that's Riel's vision of what happened in 1870, this is what Sir John A. Macdonald writes in his diary to one of his buddies. It will require a considerable management to keep those wild people quiet. In another year, the present residents will be altogether swamped by the influx of strangers who will go about with the idea of becoming industrious and peaceable settlers. And we know that begets the reign of terror and essentially creating a process that effectively denies the constitutional promise of embedded within Section 31 of the Manitoba Act around a head start and a Métis land base within Manitoba. But I want to highlight this, that those assertions, negotiations, reality of the Métis within the Red River is not just those communities that I highlighted before in locations like Lac La Biche and Lac Sainte Anne are also well in place at 1870. And the Manitoba Act is about negotiating Métis rights within the four square corners of the province into negotiation, into confederation. But what's left not dealt with is also those communities that exist outside of the Red River settlement or the old postage stamp province of Manitoba, whose rights and interests within lands outside of that territory were not dealt with through the Manitoba Act. And you see this as Canada begins to move even further westward in places like on the South Branch of the South Saskatchewan River, as well as in the Parklands area, that Métis petition for their lands in those locations. Between 1878 to 1885, 84 petitions are sent where they're all talking about dealing with the lands and the interests of the Métis within their communities in locations outside of the Red River. In, of course, the well-known events in 1884 and 1885, leading to the Second National War. That includes the battles at Duck Lake, Terrans-Coulee, and Batoche, as well as ultimately the Second Northwest Resistance in 1885. And I think it's important to understand that continuum of assertions just doesn't begin and end in the Red River, that it is in locations in what are now Saskatchewan, but also when you look at Alberta, here's just some of those assertions of whether it's at Blackfoot Crossing in 1877, or the Métis at Cypress Hills in 1878, and Métis in St. Albert in 1880. Métis, of course, as President Poitras spoke of, organizing in the 1920s. Métis petitioning in 1911 for Canada to set up a royal commission to deal with the frauds and abuses out of the Métis script system. That also coming from Fort Resolution and Fort Smith and Fort Chipewyan, requesting a royal commission to investigate script for fraud. And then we also see what Canada's response to it is through Senator Lougheed in the Senate of Canada, where there's amendments made to the criminal code in 1921 because they're afraid that non-Indigenous people are going to be blackmailed by the Métis because the Métis have been defrauded through the script system. And you see that use of law as a way to stifle, and try to cover up the frauds and abuses that lie underneath the script system. And of course, there's in Alberta, there's the Ewing Commission leading to the creation of the Métis settlements and as well as the colonies. And also it's important that Métis just we have a long history of turning to the courts. Back in the day, the Métis turned to the courts in relation to the frauds and abuses flowing from Métis script. And as I noted above, that the criminal codes actually amended, creating limitation periods on those script claims. And of course, this is where those script commissions were. Some of them done concurrently to where the historic treaties were being negotiated. For example, in 1899 for Treaty 8, which is large parts of northern Alberta. And it's really important to highlight that those Canada at the day when they're creating the scrip commissions, they say the Métis as well as the First Nations concurrently hold title in these lands and their rights need to be quote unquote extinguished at the same time. And that the Métis petition in those lands needs to be dealt with prior to opening up those lands for settlement. Now, what we know through the scrip system, and I could do an entire presentation just individually on those frauds and abuses, are that the promise that it underlies the scrip system, which is a fair and equitable settlement with the Indigenous peoples, really never comes out of the scrip system. It in fact just facilitates large exchanges of land and money into the hands of speculators and leaves many Métis communities and families dispossessed and landless. Also, these rights you can see within Ontario, or assertions within Ontario. Of course, my home community, the half-breed adhesion to Treaty Number 3 in 1875. And I think it's important to highlight that in these communities, scrip isn't made available. So what is there then attempted to be negotiated is a treaty where Métis lands can be located in and around Fort Frances. Of course, that isn't provided for. And we also see Métis assertions in Sault Ste. Marie and Penetanguishene. I do want to highlight this, that one of the fundamental things with the case law that in doing a lot of the cases to date is the assertions that you see in Eastern Canada and places in large parts of Ontario, in the southern parts of Ontario, as well as in Quebec in the East Coast, is you never see collective rights assertion in the historic evidence. What you do see is you see maybe mixed ancestry people and occasionally people being identified as half-breeds, but you don't see petitions or collective assertions at the time where colonization is taking root or the Crown is imposing their laws. And I think that that's fundamentally important about where there may be Métis communities and where there are not, which is for the purposes of Section 35, which in addition may be a different discussion than what are Métis communities that are a part of the historic Métis Nation. I think, and again, this is where I highlight the difference between what Canada interpreting its own constitution in relation to Section 35 and how the Métis nation develops its own laws, constitutions in relation to how it governs itself and how it identifies its own citizens. And I think the Métis governments that represent different portions of the Métis Nation are undertaking those processes to date. And of course, this is all a part of colonization's toolkit of how you deny, dispossess people from their lands. You begin to use licensing and tag systems and provincial boundaries to carve people up. You name them as traitors, squatters, half-breeds, and you attempt to impose control through land surveys, etc. What you do see across the Métis Nation, and I just highlighted some of them on the previous slides, is where you see a people assert themselves is where the Métis actually are, as opposed to Métis who now assert themselves, 20 minutes after a Supreme Court of Canada case comes down and they're using the term. You see in the historic record where those historic communities are, and more importantly, where those historic communities are not. And you see also the Crown using the tools of erasing Indigenous lands, laws, and legal orders from the quote unquote map of Canada. And Lady Justice conveniently becomes blind when it comes to Indigenous laws and rights, in particular, Métis pressing their claims in relation to scrip abuses, that the law essentially prohibits the Métis from pursuing those claims because of amendments made to the criminal code. And all during this period, you see leaders, like you see Métis leaders today saying, well, we, different than another national war, is that the only tool or weapon that we have left is to organize. And Métis leader Jim Brady uses this wonderful quote of saying, that's what the antecedents or the embers of the Métis Nation of Alberta today, as well as the other Métis governments that represent parts of the Métis Nation is they are that fire of people saying the only way we can fight against colonization's overwhelming force and brute force in many cases is by organizing ourselves and staying united and pushing back against those waves of colonization. And that is not just, looking to our ancestors for that. It's what, governments like the Métis Nation of Alberta are doing today in relation to constitution building. Some of the things that we see today, are the symptoms of the disempowerment and the dispossession that we've seen over the generations of this continual non-recognition of Métis governments or treating them as nothing but organizations or group. It's a part of colonization's toolkit that continues very well in today, and premiers of the province in the Western provinces know how to use it very well when the Métis get uppity. The Section 35 in 1982 is really for the Métis a fundamental turning point. It is where the courts begin to, or Lady Justice begins to recognize that there are Indigenous laws already that are pre-existing within what is now Canada, but also that the Métis are part and part of that pre-existence and not just the adjunct relatives of First Nations or the descendants of mere mixed ancestry people. And this is from the Cunningham case, which is a case about the Alberta Métis settlements, where it says that although widely recognized as culturally distinct Aboriginal peoples living in culturally distinct communities, the law remained blind to the unique needs and history of the Métis. Government slowly awoke to this legal lacuna, and the landscape dramatically changed in 1982 with the passage of the Constitution Act 1982. Section 35 recognized for the first time that the Métis were a distinct rights-bearing people. And that was supposed to be the starting gun for change in relation to Section 35. But what we really, and I've always used this analogy for it, what we really found that even though that was a constitutional promise in the highest law in Canada, it really, we've had many false and hollow political starts to implementing what Section 35 means to the Métis. And I always use this analogy of Charlie Brown and Lucy and the football, that every time we get close, Lucy, which is a crown government, pulls that football up. And whether it's the constitutional conferences in the 1980s or the Charlottetown Accord in the 1990s or the Royal Commission report or the Kelowna Accord in 2005, we get so close. And then that football gets pulled away because there's a change in government or the wind blows differently. And I think that we've taken to the courts to, or we had to turn to the courts to essentially give meaning to the purpose of Section 35 to the Métis, whether it's Section 35 Métis rights with the Powley case in 2003, whether it's dealing with outstanding Métis claims through the Manitoba Métis Federation case in 2013, or the Daniels case in 2016, which is about which door do we go knock on in relation to who has jurisdiction to deal with us. And it's quite interesting, we're finally, I think, at a place where all of the obstacles that were previously put by governments before us have been asked or answered by the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court of Canada, in the Métis favor, and finally setting it up for the time finally coming for negotiations with the Métis. So leaving the legal lacuna, I'm just going to talk a bit about where that case law, in my mind, I often refer to Powley, Daniels, and the Manitoba Métis Federation case as the trifecta of Métis law. It sets the foundation for us to begin these negotiations that are finally happening with the Métis governments on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. Of course, a change of government in Ottawa is very much helpful. That in 2015, you have the first first time Métis are actually included in the Prime Minister mandate letters. And you also have a report from a ministerial special representative in July 2016 that kind of puts all this together and really articulates that the time has finally come to deal with Métis rights. In addition, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and a better understanding within Canada that Section 35 is not this empty box that you have to go to court and fill, but it is a full box with all of the rights and interests articulated within the declaration, and that needs to be the starting point, and that those are a pre-existing starting point that needs to be reconciled with what is now Canada. And that you also have the Supreme Court of Canada increasingly recognizing that it's for Aboriginal peoples to define themselves and to choose by which means they make decisions according to their own laws, customs, and practices, which is at its very core what self-government is and what the MNA's constitution will ultimately be. And over the last 6 years, you've seen significant progress of MOUs, self-government agreements being signed. Of course, in particular, in June 2019, the MNA signed their Métis Government Recognition and Self-Government Agreement, along with Métis Nation Saskatchewan and Métis Nation of Ontario signing agreements that really are about how do you fill that legal lacuna through recognizing the existing Métis government that is already there, in addition to that constitution that will ultimately come. And I think that these agreements are innovative in one way that I just want to highlight today, because it is about how do we change that legal lacuna. And in some ways, we've reverse engineered the steps to recognition of self-government. Within those agreements, usually within negotiating a self-government agreement or a modern day treaty, the Indigenous group goes through the negotiations, signs the agreement, and then Canada will bring in legislation, or Parliament will introduce legislation in order to give legal force and effect to that agreement, and constitutionally protected. Within the self-government agreements that signed, the federal recognition legislation is contemplated up front. And in particular, why it's contemplated up front is to overcome falling into the Lucy in a football game. We know that politicians do come and go at the federal level, and some governments are very, reconciliation is a fundamental part of their agenda, whereas others not so much, or actually are aggressively against dealing with Indigenous issues. And so these agreements contemplate upfront recognition legislation that will act as the legislative cradle or for subsequent negotiations to take place. And once those Métis governments and the Government of Canada get to all of the requirements necessary, the light switch gets turned on, as opposed to having to go through bringing the implementation legislation in after the agreement is signed. We're optimistic that this legislation, which was committed to back in June 2019, will be implemented in either the spring or the fall. And it's a fundamental part of how we leave that legal lacuna once and for all, and have the comfort of knowing that Lucy can't pull the football out from under us in the future. Of course, the self-government requirements there's a series of steps that are required. This is all modern day treaty holders or self-government agreement signatories go through these, of whether it's developing a constitution, signing an intergovernmental relations agreement, developing a fiscal financing agreement, a transition plan, as well as the passage of Métis government laws by the Métis themselves, and ultimately a self-government agreement implementation plan. Fundamental that this is all anchored on that constitution that President Poitras spoke of, but also we're concurrently working on all of these other 6 steps to finally get to the place where government to government, nation to nation relationship is recognized in Canadian law based upon Métis law. So as we move forward, you see this map that has some of the historic treaties on it, as well as the modern day treaties and modern day self-government agreements. And I think we're in this process of putting Métis back on this map, that after living in the legal lacuna for generations. So seeing the time, I'm going to wrap it up there, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jason, for your presentation. That was very in-depth and very thought-provoking. Before we move on to questions, I believe there is a video that is to be shared at this point. Here we go.
Over 200 years ago, a new nation was born at the crossroads of First Nation and European societies. These were the first Métis, our ancestors. We are known as Otipemisiwak, the people who own themselves. But when a new Canada expanded into our traditional homeland, they denied our nationhood. They brought a reign of terror, stole our land, and tried to break us. Our ancestors gave their lives in the fight for our inherent rights. Forged in the fires of resistance and hardship, our people have become stronger, more resilient. Now the winds of change are blowing across our homeland. Finally, we will be recognized as an equal order of government in Canada. With the new constitution, true self-determination is within reach. The legacy we're creating will live on for generations. We are forever Métis. A new Otipemisiwak Métis government will benefit all Alberta Métis citizens and will create a roadmap for other Métis governments to follow. Centuries of struggle have led us to this moment. Now is the time to make our voices heard, to assert our rights. Now is the time to realize the dreams of our ancestors. Now is the time to honor our past and own our future. Métis Voices, Métis Constitution.
That was wonderful. Thank you for that. Our first question or comment, I should say, comes from Yvonne Petrop-Pratt, who would like to say thank you, Jason, for your important observation that we are the subjects of symbolic violence, silencing, oppression, ignoring on a continual basis. And then our first question comes from Ward Sutherland, who asks, once the Constitution is complete with the federal government, what are the provincial government's responsibilities / duties in terms of recognizing self-government?
Well, that's what's great about, and that's a really important question, and one of the reasons why with modern day treaties of that are negotiated between Indigenous nations and Canada, those agreements are then the legislation gives legal force and effect to them through the implementation legislation, constitutionally protects them, and makes them binding on all parties. So Alberta, in the same way that they would be bound by Canada's treaty that it had negotiated with the Métis Nation of Alberta, or whatever the future Métis Nation government's name was, based upon that constitution. And I think that's and I just want to connect this back to, that's what the Daniels case was about, right? Canada is the national government. It has the constitutional responsibility and jurisdiction under Section 9124 of the Constitution Act 1867 to advance relationships with Indigenous people based on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis. That's why those negotiations are occurring with Canada. Hopefully at some point in time, Alberta will become a party to them. But irrespective of, Canada does have the authority to ultimately complete a self-government treaty with the Métis Nation of Alberta, and that self-government treaty would have the force of law on all parties within Canada. And I think that is now ultimately, in many of the modern day treaty negotiations, the 92 governments or the provincial governments are parties to those negotiations, because of course that ultimate treaty is going to have an effect within the four square corners of those provinces. Notably within Ontario, the Ontario government is actually at that table with the Métis Nation of Ontario and their signatories and participating in their overarching framework agreement. Within the prairies, that is not the case with any of the prairie provinces that are currently negotiating self-government. Hopefully at some point in time that changes. I will say it's always quite challenging in the prairies in relation to those governments dealing with Indigenous rights and respecting that. But going back to your question, that is ultimately that will have to be recognized, because that is Canada's constitutional responsibility in relation to negotiating those treaties. And that's also, again, why that legislation is so key, and also why the constitutional protection of that self-government agreement is so key as well.
Wonderful. No other questions from the chat yet. I do have one question myself for Jason. I see that Section 35 happened in 1982, and although there's been all these kind of progressions along the way, right, it was still 40 years ago that happened. And I'm wondering, from your stance as a lawyer, right, how do you keep up the stamina to engage and do this amazing work?
So I will say that it is. I can only imagine, and I definitely wasn't. I was only a child when Section 35 was negotiated, and I can just imagine what the leadership thought is. Oh my goodness, we got it right. We this is going to change everything. And ... 40 years later, what a disillusionment and disempowerment of and kind of stain on Canada's history that landmark watershed event didn't bring about change. It kind of goes to me, and I kind of make fun of it because I have to in order to keep mobilized. Well, it's just Lucy doing it yet again, right? And I kind of look at it as this: is I know what my ancestors went through, and I know what our ancestors did, and they spilt blood, and they never gave up, even when we now have. It's a far different fight than going onto the battlefield with a armed and willing to give your life than now just going into a court to to articulate these things. So I think it's that spirit of fighting and never giving up. I think that is just fundamental to who the Métis people are. And if I as you can probably tell by my presentation, get very excited about that how these things have played out and about how that history has evolved. And I think that it kind of goes to President Poitras' point where she goes, governments come and go, but we're never going to stop. Like that's the problem with Crown government's plans, because they don't understand how perseverant and fundamental this is to Indigenous peoples, and we'll never give up on these things. So I think that it is disillusioning, but if you don't, and why we do education programs like this, if you don't continue the thread and add your voice and kind of do your part, it's part of a long continuum. And for me, I find that motivating. I do find it exhausting though, and even as President Poitras spoke of, the recent losses within the courts, like this is just a reality. Like we're not coming cap in hand for recognition. These governments have always been there. They're going to be there longer than the current governments, as well as judges will come and go. And there needs to be a reconciliation, with some of these fundamental facts that Canada is based upon. And I think that that kind of drives me, because we can't lose the thread on where we come from and what we're doing today. And, I keep on hoping that there won't be a Lucy in the football, and that this time we're actually gonna, kick the field goal.
Well put. Thank you very much. I believe we are finished with questions. I will hand it back over to Shalene for closing remarks.
Well, I just wanted to thank our presenters so much, President Poitras and Jason Madden, for all your work you do and continuing this fight. I thank you, a big thank you to the audience and the two live chat moderators, Leah Hertzen and Julia Kalu. And I just wish everyone a really good day and week. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.